Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Forster. I'm Executive Director of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers. I want to thank you all for coming today, and I hope everyone is well and healthy. And I wish we were able to have this presentation in person, but these are strange times. I remember my grandmother, who was born in 1899, telling me about volunteering on Navy Pier in Chicago during the flu pandemic to take care of soldiers. And my mother actually didn't ever learn how to swim because when she was that age, they kept having polio. So the pools and beaches were all closed. And now we're in the COVID-19 outbreak. I guess the good news is technology like this makes it easier for us to do some of our work, which is a blessing. And I'm grateful to you for taking the time to sign on today, and grateful for this platform to share this information with you. Um, I know many of the names that I'm seeing on this webinar, and I miss seeing you in person, but we'll connect on the other side of this. I know we will. So if you look at your screen, you have a few options here. You can give us a thumbs up if you can hear me. If you see that control. Oh, there's one, too. Okay. And if you also look, there's a chat function, and you can use that to ask questions. And we'll stop. We're going to kind of have a couple of breaks between the three of us, and so we can stop and answer some questions, and maybe if there's time at the end, we can do that. We're recording the session and we'll post it on our homepage, so if you want to share it with friends, neighbors, people in your lake association, people at work, whatever, it should be there. When it became clear that Minnesota Lakes and Rivers had to cancel our Water Connects Us All conference in May, we were disappointed. We had a lot of great sessions and field trips. The conference was going to be at the University of Minnesota, so there was a lot of great stuff to do and see there. One of the trips that we had planned was to the St. Anthony Lab at right in downtown Minneapolis at St. Anthony Falls with researcher Jeffrey Marr, who's on this webinar right now. And I'll let him tell you about it, but the lab is very old and very well regarded. And it studies fluid dynamics using flow from the St. Anthony Falls. That's kind of their specialty. And I'm also grateful that when I asked Jeff to participate, he agreed to do it in this format, which is a little clunky maybe. We also have Chuck Becker, and Chuck is the president of the Big Sugar Bush Lake Association and one of the co-founders of the Safe Wakes organization. Today, we're going to talk about boats and their impacts on lakes. Minnesotans love boats. There are over 825,000 registered watercraft in Minnesota. Only Florida has more registered watercraft than Minnesota, and they have 4 times the population of Minnesota. Recreational boating in Minnesota is a $3.1 billion industry, and it supports about 11,000 jobs. Annual sales of new boats are about 807 million. But boating is changing in Minnesota in dynamic ways. The size, power, and number of boats in Minnesota is going up with a 36% increase in the last 20 years. The number of boats between 16 and 26 feet has increased 118%, while the number of boats less than 16 feet declined 27%. So gone are the days of the boat I learned to drive on, old aluminum with a 25 horsepower motor, and we actually used to water ski behind that thing. From 1987 to 2001, the average horsepower of a boat in Minnesota increased from 46 to 74 horsepower. It contracted a little during the 2008 recession, and then the trend towards larger and more powerful boats has accelerated. And in this realm of kind of expanding boat recreation in Minnesota, one of the fastest growing segments is that of what is known as enhanced wake watercraft. And these are perhaps the most powerful recreational boat on the market today. These boats are used for wake surfing, where a person literally surfs on the wake behind the boat as if they were in the ocean. It's incredibly popular. It looks like a lot of fun. I've never done it. I would try it. And this is a relatively new watercraft, and many of you may never have seen one in operation, and that's part of the reason for having this webinar. And Chuck Becker knows a lot about these. He's done a lot of research. He's become very involved in this issue, how the boats work, and the unintended impacts that they can have to lake recreation and ecology. So, Chuck, do you want to take over?
Sounds good, Jeff.
I'll launch your webinar here.
Okay. All right, Jeff, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. Wake enhancing watercraft, which are typically known as wake boats, are relatively new phenomena to Minnesota. With the research I've done, probably the last 3 years or so, we've started to see a significant increase of these boats, and particularly the sport of wake surfing, which Jeff just described to you. While this is relatively new to Minnesota, not so new on both coasts and other states. I've talked to folks around the country and in Canada, and they've been dealing with wake boats and wake surfing for a longer period of time than typically Minnesota has. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these boats. So I think it's important to know that these boats are pretty unique in the fact that they're the only boat, at least that I'm aware of, recreational sport boat that is specifically designed to create massive artificially enhanced wakes to facilitate wake surfing and wakeboarding. More so right now, what we're hearing from the boating dealers is what people want to do nowadays is wake surfing. And that's where the largest wakes are actually created to facilitate that water sport. And I think it's also good to mention that unlike other recreational water sport boats, these wakes are a lot bigger, more energy. If you take a high-powered water ski boat or fishing boat, they are designed to get up on plane quickly and create very little wake. In fact, if you're a water skier, you don't want any wake. So these boats are quite a bit different in the type of wake that they create, and they're designed exactly to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about how that all goes about. And again, every element of the design from the factory is with the goal of creating these massive wakes. So it starts out with the design of the hull, and they're typically deep V bottoms, hard keels, designed to plow through the water and displace an enormous amount of water, which creates bigger, crisper wakes or waves. They also deflect water downward at an extreme angle to optimize that wake. And to propel the boats, because they are heavy, particularly when you add the ballast, they probably start at 300 horsepower for a pretty small boat and go up to 500 horsepower plus in order to push that boat around, in order to deal with the weight of the boat and create that massive wake. Again, substantially higher horsepower than your typical runabout ski boat, bass boat, what have you. Again, basically when Jeff was talking about wake surfing, it's surfing without a rope. They like a flat, calm lake, and the boat is only moving at 10 to 11, maybe 12 miles an hour, which seems to, as the industry says, defy physics and logic. And the wake behind the boat is attributed largely from the water that the boat is displacing. And the heavier the boat, the more water displaced, the bigger the wake. So these boats typically weigh down the stern of the boat, the rear of the boat, with ballast, basically water that is brought into the boat. And the boat either has hard cavities or bags or what have you to take on that water. And depending upon the size of those ballast tanks or bladders, an extra 1,500 to 5,000 pounds of water, some even 6,000 pounds of water can be added and taken into the boat in order to increase the weight and the wake. Typical wake boat is probably close to 6,000 pounds dry weight, more in the neighborhood of 400 plus horsepower, carrying 16 passengers. And And again, that ballast water might be 2,500 to 4,000 pounds plus. Gross weight, when you add all of that up, is probably in the 10,000 to 12,000 pound range. So a heavy, heavy boat plowing through the water at 10 to 11 miles an hour. And these boats typically start at about $100,000 and can go $250,000 plus, depending upon the options. So this is a boat that requires a lot of money to buy, and but they are getting more and more popular out there. So we've got wake boats are coming out of the factory, but another thing we have to be aware of is that there's also wake enhancing aftermarket equipment that is now being manufactured and can be purchased. And basically for less than $500, you can turn your ski boat or runabout into a wake boat. So that's a little bit scary to me. You don't have to spend $100,000 or $250,000 for a wake boat. You can actually get some aftermarket equipment for a pretty cheap price and be wake surfing out there as well. There's also hybrid boats now being developed and sold that you can actually have a pontoon boat that you can wake surf behind. So people can kind of get the best of both worlds if that's what you choose to do. So why should we be concerned about wake boats? I've listed a number of things here. Many of you on the phone are probably familiar with some of these, but I think the biggest thing for a lot of folks is the environmental damage to the water body itself. Once a water body is damaged, you can't just flip a switch and have it get back to the water quality that you had prior to it being damaged. And because of the tremendous wakes that these boats create, tremendous wake energy, you get damage certainly at the lake shore as they hit the shoreline and come up the slope of the shore. But even as they travel during the particular wake surfing mode, the thrust of these boats is going farther down, much farther down the water column towards the bottom than other typical recreational sport boats. So you've got what results there is actually uprooted vegetation, disturbance of dormant sediments, which releases phosphorus into the water column, which is not good for water quality, damage to fish spawning habitat, etc. Obvious disturbance too, again, fish and wildlife habitat, greater risk of transfer AIS, etc. And I'll go into some of those a little bit more. And I think just to note that these concerns are really magnified when these boats are running on smaller, narrow, shallow lakes that just cannot, just are not big enough to have these boats operate without doing significant damage and causing significant safety issues. But even bays of large lakes, if you take Lake Minnetonka, they're having trouble out there because several of these boats will gather in the same bay and operate in that same bay all day. And that is a concern of theirs. In a lake like Gull Lake, 10,000 acres, if the Gull Lake is choppy or busy, these boats will go up the channel to the Gull chain of lakes and operate on the much smaller lakes in the chain. I know of at least 3 lakes in Minnesota that are less than 250 acres, and these boats have resident on the lake 15 to 25 plus wake boats, and they also have public accesses, which adds even more traffic and leads to more damage and the concerns that we have here in front of us. I think we should also note that the concerns listed, any boat can damage. Any boat can cause concerns if they're operated irresponsibly. However, wake boats are being operated in essence as they're designed. It's not that people are being irresponsible. They're operating exactly as designed. Unfortunately, we don't have any regulations to keep them farther away from shore or on the bigger lakes, and that's where the problem comes in. Talked about environmental harms, damage to lake quality, shoreline erosion, plant and wildlife, etc. Certainly diminished fisheries. Certainly if you're a fisherman, you should be concerned. Not only will you be rocked and rolled out there when you're trying to fish, but it is doing some things under the water that you probably might not be aware of. Certainly sediment resuspension. I talked a little bit about the phosphorus, nearshore turbidity, things like that. Those are all things that together will damage the quality of the lake and the waters and the habitat in general of the lake. They're designed, again, to throw the large wake. They're going to keep the waters turned up. And just not a good thing for our lakes and the folks using the lakes, as well as the fish and other wildlife in the lake. These are just a couple of pictures on lakes where they did not have what you're seeing today prior to the advent of wake boats on these lakes. And you can see what the powerful wakes can do as they hit shore, particularly when they're operated too close to shore, where the wakes do not have time to dissipate to a degree that they will not cause damage. Again, another picture of that, not only damaging the shore, but going up and actually taking out vegetation on the shoreline. Again, which leads to sediment going back into the lake, release of phosphorus, etc. So it's not just out in the water, it's actually at the lake shore as well. Safety concerns. Again, very, very powerful wakes. I know of a number of examples of folks that have been injured on the water. While water skiing, people on their docks having been knocked off their docks and injured, trapped between a moored boat and the dock. People who cannot let their kids go to the beach while these boats are operating because of the powerful wakes that will knock them over. I know of a situation out in Oregon this past summer where a rowing crew was out practicing, a group of 4 people plus the person directing them, and a wake boat went by. The wake hit the rowing scow and broke it in half. Certainly if you're on the lake in a non-motorized craft, canoe, watercraft, canoe, paddleboard, kayak, what have you, you probably want to be very, very careful or just get off the lake, which is what most people do. Talked a little bit about AIS, aquatic invasive species. There have been studies done, including a study by a gentleman named Adam Dahl, who is an employee of the Minnesota DNR. As part of his master's thesis, he studied the residual water in watercraft. And one of his conclusions was that certain types of AIS have the chance of living the longest in the ballast tanks of wake boats because they simply cannot be fully depleted when the boat leaves the water. And that leaves gallons of water in the boat yet. If there are invasive species and that boat is then taken to a non-infested lake within the next couple of days or more, and water is then brought in from the non-infested lake and then depleted again as much as they can when they leave the lake, that can transport that AIS to a non-infested lake. Huge issue. We've got enough AIS already, and now we know that these boats going from an infested to a non-infested lake can certainly have that higher risk of transporting that AIS. I said we don't really have regulations in Minnesota. The boating guide does say it's against the law to operate a watercraft, so it's wash or wake endangers, harasses, or interferes with any persons or property. And we've probably many of us on this call today have experienced that. However, it's very hard to enforce because unless the DNR conservation officer or the county water patrol actually sees it, it's very hard for them to ticket somebody if they have not personally seen that activity. And that's why, actually, one of the reasons why I think we need some regulations, some meaningful regulations of these boats, not just in Minnesota, but across the country where we're experiencing these same issues. Mentioned other states, also Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I've done a lot of research, talked to hundreds of people across the U.S. and Canada. It's not just Minnesota experiencing these issues, these concerns. And many of these states have been experiencing these concerns longer than we have. Here's a list of states that I'm aware of that are considering creating restrictions, have been talking about it. And those discussions continue, sometimes at the state level, sometimes at smaller jurisdictions. But we're not alone in here in Minnesota with having these concerns and trying to work out something reasonable to deal with these boats, but get away from the concerns that we should all have. Here's a quote by Larry Meddock. Mr. Meddock is the chair of the Water Sports Industry Association. This is a quote to Minnesota Public Radio in July of 2019, a little less than a year ago. And what Mr. Meddock said in his interview is that we don't have a wake issue. We have a behavior issue with young captains. And he goes on to say, as long as you get at least 200 feet offshore, all these so-called tidal waves that are washing over, knocking down grandchildren and swamping boats, they just disappear. I would strongly disagree with that. These boats are operating as designed. If they're operated 200 feet from shore, they will cause the issues that Mr. Meddock refers to and the other concerns that I've listed previously. So the truth is, 200 feet does virtually nothing to address the impacts of wake boats. 200 feet is a number the industry came up with based on a study they commissioned. However, the full report of that study that was finally released, I believe in late October 2019, the full report contained no such conclusion from their expert. This is a conclusion that they reached after analyzing their own consultant's study. And again, I strongly disagree with it. And I'm sure many of you on the call who have experienced these boats would also suggest that 200 feet is not really even a starting point. And that's one of the reasons that we need more study to get at the reality of these wakes and what is reasonable to potentially allow these boats to continue to operate, but without causing the damage and the other concerns, including safety, that I've noted here. So as Jeff mentioned, I belong to a small startup grassroots organization called Safe Wakes for Minnesota Lakes. There's just 6 of us, and we're pretty novices at this. We haven't done it before. We're trying to find our way. Our main mission is really to educate people, because most people in Minnesota have never heard of a wake boat. They never heard of wake surfing. And I think we need to educate folks, get them to understand what this is. Folks that have not seen these boats on their lake, if they've got a public access or they have people buying a home on the lake that have the money, you're very likely to see wake boats. We are certainly trying to build a coalition of like-minded folks and organizations to protect all of Minnesota lakes and navigable rivers. This isn't just a small lake issue. It's not just a big lake issue. It's also an issue for our lakes. And just to comment on that, there was a recent article from Goodhue County in Minnesota, the southern part of the state, that it's on the Mississippi River. They were already experienced wake surfers down there in the middle of April, I'm sure with wetsuits. And their concern was, typically with the spring, you've got the snow melt and higher river water as well as lakes. And they were already getting damage to the river shores there, the banks of the river, and concerned that the wake surfing was starting so early. Found out later that on Lake Minnetonka in the cities, wake surfers were out already, as well as other lakes in the Twin Cities where ice is out. I'm looking out my window here at my lake, the lake I'm on, still see ice out there. So no wake boats yet on Big Sugarbush Lake. So I'd encourage you folks that are concerned and are like-minded to check out the Safe Wakes website, safewakes.org. I would also strongly encourage you to be observant. Take pictures, take video. document your stories. And if you'd like to send those to contact us at safewakes.org. It's going to take citizen activism to make things happen here in Minnesota as well as in other states. And we need folks to step up and be vigilant and speak out because if we wait for the government to do it, it's not going to happen. It's going to take vigilance on the part of the folks that care about our lakes and rivers here and are willing to speak up and protect our precious resources.
Chuck, we
Yeah,
got
Jeff.
a question, which is a good segue here.
Okay.
Christopher asked what other research has been done on wake dissipation and effects on shoreline compared to other natural forces, wind and ice and so forth. And so, Jeff, are you?
I'm here. Should we transition over and talk about research a bit?
Sure.
Yeah. And you're gonna. And
How's that?
that's good. We can't see you though, Jeff.
That might be a good thing.
Yeah. I know I've got my hat on. I'm overdue
Yeah,
at the shop.
yeah. Well, so great. Thank you, and I'm really glad to be here. My name is Jeff Marr. I'm a research engineer at the University of Minnesota. I work as the Associate Director of Engineering at a laboratory called the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. And it's a special laboratory. I'm a bit biased. I love the place. I've worked there over 20 years. And I show a picture here on my first slide that shows a view of out of downtown Minneapolis, looking towards, on the right of the image, you'll see the Stone Arch Bridge. You'll see the St. Anthony Falls in the middle of the photograph. And our laboratory is just in the far field. We were completed actually in 1938, so 82 years now that we've been in existence, and we were built for the purpose we're serving today. We are a hydraulic research laboratory, and we are a fairly good size one in the US. And the way we work is by taking water from the upper levels of the St. Anthony Falls pool, and it actually routes through our building and discharges in the intermediate pool here in the river system. So we have access to a lot of free water. And inside of our building are a lot of tanks and facilities for studying problems like the one we're talking about today. So I wanted to share a bit about that laboratory. I am going to, Jeff, you can jump in, but I thought I might just turn my camera off because I believe this slideshow gets a little bigger. So I'll advance here. A little bit more about our laboratory just to give context. And we specialize in what we call environmental fluid mechanics. So the group I work with is a group of staff researchers, PhD level, master's degree, and undergrads that study the environment. We study fluid flow, we study lakes and rivers, harbors, and we study sediment, we study vegetation. And we have a lot of different ways to do that. And I show a few photographs here. The upper left photograph is one of our largest channels and actually one of the larger research channels in the US. This is a 300-foot long, it's 9 feet wide that you see here, and it's connected to that river. And I can run this as a river simulation tank. And for this problem, it actually has something very interesting. It has a really large wave generator. So it can generate waves that are 2 feet in size in an indoor setting where we have very sophisticated instrumentation. Right of that is an image of a simulation. So using supercomputers to simulate phenomena like waves. And this is a simulation of wind-driven wave, actually. You can see the red and orange colors are the wind driving a breaking wave surface. And this is all done with supercomputers. We do a lot of work in the field. The lower image is a buoy for lakes that we deploy out in lakes, and there's automatic cabling and reeling that drops sensors down and up over a whole course of the summer, just continually mapping water quality. On the far right is one that's related to what we're talking about here. This is ongoing work for monitoring wave heights. Actually, it's a autonomous system that with solar power and different sensors to monitor and log wind-driven waves, and this has been used over the last 2 summers. This work, by the way, funded by the LCCMR, and is just completing now, but it gives you wind speed and direction and can map the wave height from wind-driven waves over long periods of time. So the point here is that this is one of the University of Minnesota facilities that is available to our state and to communities for carrying on research that's important. I also want to mention this phrase here I wrote called research training, and this is something we feel very strongly about. Research training is a term we use to describe just training the next generation of engineers, of scientists, and that's a large part of what we do, working with undergrads and students, training them to be our future resource managers and engineers in the state. Okay, let's move into this. So what I thought I'd do here is just give a quick snapshot of the research that we're aware of pertaining directly to wake boats and wake surfing. And I'll just show you 3 of these are fairly commonly cited, but just so you get a sense of the kind of work that's been done so far. And this first study was carried out in Quebec, published in 2014 as a report. I'll include an assessment of, is this a peer-reviewed paper? It's not clear to me whether this has been through a peer review process. It's not a journal article. It looks like a laboratory report of some kind. That doesn't mean the work isn't high quality, but it doesn't appear to me that it's been through a really robust peer review process. What I'm showing here is an image from that work. In the brown areas that represents the shoreline, and the way these tests are done is they operate the watercraft at certain distances from shoreline and from a sensor position where they have different kinds of devices, an acoustic Doppler velocimeter and other sensors that measure wave height, and they're driving that boat under different conditions at different distances. And that's a very common setup that's been done on a number of studies. What did they find in this work? What they've published is that the wave energy was increased by a factor of 4 in some of their test cases when they're operating under a wave surf scenario. So that's not wave height per se, it's wave energy. So that's the amount of energy, and there's different ways of calculating that over a standard waves. Impact is inversely related to the distance from shoreline. That makes sense. As we get farther away, those waves are dissipating. Wake surf operation causes the greatest impacts at the shore, almost 2 times higher than normal boat operation. An interesting observation is that the slope of the shoreline seems to impact that impact itself. So steeper versus shallow shorelines, and we would think, it makes sense that even the maximum depth of a lake is important. They make a statement in here that wave energy dissipates completely before reaching the banks when it's at 300 meters or more. So that's a big impact, a big distance for complete dissipation. And one of the questions we can ask from a resource management question is complete dissipation necessary for these? We have different waves, wind-driven waves and others. What is the right amount of dissipation that we need to set a distance? So that's a question a policymaker might want to wrestle with. The second paper I'm putting up here, wake surfing, some wakes are more equal than others. This one is a conference paper published from a group in Australia. So again, Chuck's point, this is an international issue of concern. The same kind of setup in the previous paper I showed, and some of the data they're measuring at different positions from the boat itself. They have 1, 2, and 3 different stations, differing distances from the boat itself. And you can see the closest one, the wave train that we'd call it, of the series of waves coming off that wake, are pinched together closer. And as it gets farther from the source, that spreads out. Some of their findings, wave energy again is increased. Wave heights are increased 1.5 times, 1.6 times. Interesting in this paper that the authors recommend that wake surfing be assessed and managed separately from other type of powerboat operations. So they identified the wakes being unique enough that it required or recommended different types of management approaches. And an important thing that we would want to think about in Minnesota is something about the frequency, or how active is the water. Is it a 4th of July weekend and we're seeing a lot of activity versus one boat a day? So something that can accumulate cumulative impact over a period of time is something to think about in terms of managing a resource. A third paper, which takes a different approach, is looking at something Chuck talked about, is the wash, or the jet coming off of the engine itself, and how that is impacting the bottom of the lake. And so this work, which again comes out of Quebec, again, this work to me doesn't look like it was not published as a peer-reviewed journal paper. It looks like a laboratory report. And again, I want to make clear, I'm not saying that doesn't mean it's valid work in any way. What they're finding in this, so let me talk about the setup. The setup was a single boat moving in a water body, and they put a sensor on the bottom of the lake called an acoustic Doppler current profiler, an ADCP, and that, which is an upward looking device, and it can tell us what the velocity profile is in the vertical of that water column. And I'm showing right out of their paper some of the data that they found. So the y-axis here is the depth in meters, and excuse me, the x-axis is time, and this is about 4 hours of time. And you can see these red spikes that stick down into the water column, and those are different times when the boat was driven, or its route was over top of this device as time scrolled past. And each one of these was a higher velocity. And you can see the penetrations were 4 or 5 meters into the water column. So these are interesting findings to document. Yes, these boats are actually penetrating quite far into the water column. The duration of that disturbance they publish is 70 to 80 seconds. So they also published that wake surf wakeboard has the potential to impact water column and remobilize bottom sediments up to 5 meters. My assessment is that was somewhat based on, that's a hypothesis that they're putting out based on scientific reading. If we're disturbing that water column, we have the ability to erode or kick up fines at the bottom of the lake, etc. Okay, so those are some of the really available literature that we've found on studying this. And there's other, from the academic side, we know that there's a lot of other relevant literature, however, not directly on this topic. So topics like turbulent jets in quiescent water. This is a fundamental fluid mechanic topic that's been studied for 50 years in different ways. Boat and ship wake design, hull design. These are some of the fundamental topics that motivated creation of hydraulic laboratories in the US, is design of ship hulls, etc. Sediment transport, which is an area that I study in the near zone, marine settings, river settings, and lakes, and so forth. Shoreline protection guidelines. So I'm a civil engineer, and we take classes on how do you design riprap. If you're a landowner and you've paid for a riprap, it's expensive. And there are design guidelines that go into how that's done that are published by all kinds of different groups. And that's important to this question. And then a really big area is vegetation and sediment interaction with waves and currents. Still ongoing research in this area, and it's a many complicated questions involved in the interaction of waves or currents with vegetation and sediment. So what I wrote here is, there's a lot of fundamental research. I showed you a few examples of really focused research, but in general, we think there's a lack of research on the specific issue we're talking about here. How do boat-generated waves and jets impact lake shorelines and bottoms? And how do extreme waves change these? So we've been talking about at our laboratory, developing, kind of refining down the questions, and what we do is we look for funding. So we're kind of in that stage now of assessing the problem and building teams and looking for opportunities to write proposals. And so that's where we are right now. And the rest of the talk just kind of outlines some of our thinking. I hope you find it informative at any rate. So I wrote this big red statement: research is needed to better understand boat-generated wave impacts to Minnesota lakes. to help guide the evolving and growing use of our lakes. The idea here is we as a university, we try to do our best to stay unbiased, to provide quality data that others can use to teach, they can use to develop policy, or to develop guidelines. And so that would be our kind of our motivation. So what can a research program study provide? We think we could provide robust and unbiased data that characterizes waves, prop wash, of common powerboats operating in Minnesota. So not really focusing exclusively on wake surf boats, but other types of powerboats as well. Robust data that characterizes how shoreline zones and lake bottoms are affected by powerboats. And then all this information gets passed out and provide outcomes in a form that can be distributed to others, to other stakeholders, and then information that can be rolled up into education and training classes. So if you, just to pick this apart a bit, some research questions focusing on wakes and waves. I talked at the beginning about some ongoing work looking at wave-driven, wind-driven waves monitored over a full summer. And this is an image of the mast and some of the data that my colleague Bill Herb has developed. This x-axis is in seconds, so this is 40 seconds of time, and you can see the wave heights bouncing around here. But he's done this over long periods of time, over kind of a full summer duration. And what he can get with that then is an envelope of relationships, things like wind speed versus wave height. And he can, with a lot of data points, you start to see what is the behavior on this body of water for winds of a certain direction. And this is important information if we want to develop a baseline for what kind of wave activity is out there. We think we can do the same for motorboat, for powerboat waves. Monitoring over a whole summer, we could develop what's the envelope of typical waves that we see out there right now. Another example taken from work in the Chesapeake area, this is a plot of turbidity, or the clarity of the water, versus time. And these times are in days over the 4th of July period. And what's interesting here is they're seeing spikes in time over holiday and weekend periods. And we might think that that might be something we'd see in our data looking at boat waves, right? 4th of July weekend or something like this. So this is something we think we can do pretty quickly and would be very informative. Next slide is blank. The next part of what we think would be a great study would be to really look at individual boats themselves. And our thought is picking 3 different common boats. I've shown just a fishing boat and a runabout, and then a wake boat itself. This is just as an example, 3 common types of boats, and we'd set up a situation that I've tried to draw here with Goldie Gopher in a boat cruising at a certain distance from shoreline with some of the sophisticated instrumentation we have available to shoot up in the water column and look at velocity fields and look at the near bed kinds of velocities that are impacting sediment and vegetation. And so this is a study that we think we could do through careful selection of sites and figuring out what kind of variable space we want to explore. What comes out of this is not only baseline information, perhaps from the first 2 Watercraft here, but also being able to tease out differences, perhaps ski boats operating in a certain trim condition and other types of recreational craft. Now, so not really focusing on a watercraft specifically, but looking at how waves and waves of different magnitude have those, what their impacts are. Prop wash is another issue. It would be very interesting to look at, again, from a multi-watercraft type point of view. We think we can improve on the work that was done here. This is really informative and evidence that the approach would work. We use similar types of sensors with, we can add a few other sensors that really get us at the bottom effects going on in this, and also water quality, turbidity, and other types of measurements of how prop wash might be affecting deeper water systems. Excuse me. Just a few more slides here. A third area, and this is one that we're still talking about, and is where do the kind of the source. If you think of the boat as the source of energy, source of waves, and so forth, how do those interact with vegetation and soil? And this is where we would really turn to the laboratory. So some questions I list here, what are the forces? What forces are required to uproot or break aquatic vegetation? What role aquatic plants have in absorbing wave energy? An important feedback here that waves can actually absorb energy out of the system. Soil and sediment, again, issues of shoreline erosion, bank protection materials, and their survivability, etc. How are these impacted by waves? We think that the laboratory now becomes a really important tool for us to work at large scale, such in this big channel, using computational tools or other types of basin facilities that are available to study these things. So that's kind of where we're at, thinking at St. Anthony Falls Lab at the university. And certainly there are other resources available in our state and college system at university, at Twin Cities, and at UMD. And so I would just encourage my colleagues in those systems to connect with you all, or those that are interested in this topic. We certainly feel that well-designed research can provide insights, can provide data needed to help with guidance and policy development. We love working in coalitions and partnerships, and in this topic, they're really crucial. So, again, I appreciate being on the call, and happy to answer questions.
Hello, Jeff. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. There was one, have weight boat manufacturers taken part in any solution-based studies? And I think the answer is yes. They've done a report on it. Not, to the depth that you're talking about, Jeff. Todd asks us, we hear some comments that the normal wind-driven waves over a summer do much more damage to the shore and near shore area than large boat wakes. Would your research be able to help us figure out if that has any truth?
I think it would, because that's what, teasing out the difference of what waves do we already see, wind driven or boat. That's a baseline.
Right.
And my colleague, we're working to separate out wind driven effects now. So if we can add kind of baseline boat wakes, and then if we look at these individual watercraft, we ought to be able to tease out those differences. One thing I didn't talk about is the frequency, duration. A really busy weekend versus one boat in an evening as the sun is setting. What those impacts are, we don't know. But we think, we can design a research project to get at those questions. Ice is another topic. I have not dealt with ice here. So
you saw the question on ice?
I saw it earlier, and we'd love to study ice, but that's not
ice eating. Would research on all types of boat waves and wind waves is fantastic and is exactly what is needed to make educated decisions. For wind wave data, would distance from the shoreline be assessed to compare different sized lakes or channels?
Ooh, maybe say that again if I didn't hear.
For wind wave data, would distance from shoreline be assessed to compare different sized lakes or channels?
I know that for wind-driven waves, we're really looking at the fetch distance, the distance that the wind has to work, right? The long distance of that wind pathway into the shoreline. And that has been considered in the study I referenced. If the question is how those wind-driven waves change offshore as you move away from the impact zone, that's something we could do. I don't know if my colleague is doing that. I think he has essentially one nearshore device.
And they asked, are you currently doing any research on boat waves?
We are not. The answer is no. We are not doing.
Okay. And what effect do wake boats have on oxygen levels at the bottoms of lakes with turbulence? Example, possible effects on well-being of fish and all life at the bottom and possible contribution to fish kills in shallow lakes.
Mm. It would only be, I would just be thinking about possible impacts. It's something we haven't studied. I think the questions that have come across our discussions are thinking about the deeper water um, in boat situations where those turbulence is getting deeper in the water column, perhaps below a thermocline, and increasing the mixing or position of the thermocline in the water column, changes in kicking fine sediment that has nutrients attached to it, and how that changes the water quality, water chemistry, availability for algal blooms and things like that. That's what comes to mind. It's not something we've
Right.
studied directly in this context.
James asks, what is needed to fund this research?
Great question. Um, these so we can design projects as big or as little. There's limits on the bottom end of how small you can go to have a successful, robust project. Um, something like I've laid out here, something that would be a 3 or 4 year project can be $500,000 to $700,000 with, especially if we're bringing in numerical modeling and have a graduate student or two on that project. Um, on the low end, we think something like a $40,000 or $50,000 project gets us in the field. It gets us putting these continuous monitors out there um, as soon as possible. So that's that. If that helps, kind of bracket a range of work.
Are wake boats jet propulsion or propellers?
Their propeller, it's a inboard where the engine sits in the aft of the boat and the back end, and their V drive systems where they transition the shaft through the bottom of the boat. The fixed prop.
And Todd makes the suggestion to see if Boat Manufacturers Association would be willing to help fund and participate in the study, which is a good idea. And I think some of the boat people are on the call, so I can investigate that.
Well, we've been
Uh,
involved in, what I can say about it is this is where you transition to some relationship and trust building, to know that I can say that I'm going to be an unbiased researcher, but that's where you build trust. Because look, it is what it is. I mean, these are businesses and they're small businesses in many cases, and it's recreation but at the same time, it's lakes that all can access. So we have worked in those kinds of situations before, and we'd welcome at least a discussion.
um, do any of the presenters know much about native aquatic plants and how they are impacted by wakes? I'm thinking that they are not evolved to these huge disturbances and that this could simply add another stressor on top of invasive plants, climate change, etc.
Jeff, this is Chuck. I would just comment that we've seen it in our lake, and again, we have not had a great deal of wake surfing going on, but within hours of the first wake surf boat going by, people saw large mats of floating uprooted vegetation. And so if the boats are operated in shallower areas, again, in the littoral zones, 15 feet or less, likely it is going to the bottom and it is literally uprooting the vegetation, the native vegetation at the bottom of the lake.
Right. Well, and I think one of the key things here is the changes that are happening in Minnesota lakes are um, larger, more powerful boats, sort of a spectrum with wakeboard boats, very powerful on one end, and then, down to, um, a canoe or something like that. And any boat um can have an impact on the bottom or sediment. If I take the old 18-foot aluminum boat with a 25 horse motor and run it in 2.5 feet of water through a weed bed, through aquatic plants, I'm going to churn it up and damage the plants and add phosphorus to the water column and impact fish habitat and plant life and so forth. Or, driving a regular runabout too close to shore can swamp loon nests and throw up big wakes and impact some shores. So I think, kind of looking at uh, wakes in general, I think it's a good time uh, for that. And then, I'm on a large lake, Lake Vermilion, and there's a lot of unsafe operation of watercraft on Lake Vermilion. It's a big lake, it's very rough, can be very rough, and people have issues, they have problems. Uh, Basically, from a public safety standpoint. And there are some early indications that boating violation rates, as well as conflicts due to poor boating etiquette and lack of knowledge about the rules of the road, are increasing. The U.S. Coast Guard estimates that 81% of boating deaths occurred on boats where the operator did not receive boater safety instruction. Only 14% of deaths on watercraft occurred on vessels where the operator had received a nationally approved boating safety education certificate. Um, the threat of aquatic invasive species puts additional responsibility on boaters of all descriptions to prevent the spread, and education is the first line of defense there, suggesting the need for increased training, particularly for more complex watercraft that have plumbing and pumps, and they're taking water on and pumping water off, even a houseboat. Enhanced wake watercraft are growing in popularity. It's a big growth sector for the boating industry. But if they're used improperly, they can damage water quality in the lakes, shoreline. They can damage property. Chuck went through all those. And the increased speed and power of watercraft today is remarkable. I was out last summer on a bass boat that went 70 miles an hour. I was just, I was shocked at how fast it was. And with more boats on our waters and a wider diversity of recreational boating activities, conflicts among users are becoming more common. And using the educational platform, and this is what we were working on this year. Actually, we were working with the boating industry starting last summer, through the summer and into the legislative session, on a boaters operators certificate. Chuck, you quoted Larry Medoc from the Water Sports Industry Association saying, "We don't have a wake issue, we have a behavior issue." And I agree, but I might further clarify that word, behavior, and say education. And I have some friends here in the cities that have been very involved in AIS issues, even professionally involved, very active in lake association work. And I ran into them at a birthday party a few months ago, and they asked me, "Well, what are you working on? What do you know?" And I started talking about that Adam Dahl study of different, he looked at different types of boats and where water could be held, like inside inboard motor in the cooling system or in the bilge or in a live well, the little bit of water that remains in the live well because of the way the plug is. Wakeboard boats, found that wakeboard boats, because of where the ballast tanks are, the amount of water they hold, they're below deck, so they're out of the sunlight, so they don't get as warm, have the highest risk of transporting AIS. And they got this sick look on their face. And they looked at me and they said, "Oh, we have a boat that we keep on Minnetonka, which is infested with zebra mussels, and we take it up to our lake, and our lake just got infested with zebra mussels. Could we have been the ones to transport them?" And, at the party, I said, oh, probably not. But I mean, the answer is maybe, you know. So this really struck home the point to me that, with boaters of all descriptions, having the best information based on science is really important. So we worked with many lake groups. Muskies Inc. signed on to a sign-on letter, Anglers for Habitat, marina owners, resort owners. We urged the legislature to pass legislation requiring the DNR to convene interested parties and make recommendations on what a boat operator certificate would look like. The water sports industry lobbyists did offer some objection to some of the language in the bill, but they've been supportive of the concept and more formal focused training and certification for boating. And at the hearing, the DNR, Colonel Rodman Smith, who's the DNR enforcement, got up and made an interesting point. He said, we have an operator's certificate for every motor vehicle in the state. We have a gun safety training permit required before you can buy a hunting license in Minnesota. But for boats, we have no training and no certification program. And I think it's time. And we believe strongly that science should inform the policies. So, base the training around the best available science. And that same bill that we are working on would have also, asked the DNR to convene and provide a study. It also would have provided some funding to groups like MASERC, Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, or the lab at St. Anthony, to focus on some of these questions and try and figure out what the impacts might be and, what information people need in order to operate these boats to, avoid damaging the environment. And I think that a mandatory boat operator's permit would improve the safety and enjoyment by all users and help protect the lakes while promoting the increased use of the resource. And I am going to look here. I was going to let you know that when this is over, I'll send people a note with the Safe Wakes site. And I'm looking to see more questions about industry participating in the study. Is there interest in the legislature? And I think there was. I think that the legislature is pretty sensitive to lake issues by and large. And what happened was we had one hearing in the House, and then before there could be a hearing in the Senate, the coronavirus stay-at-home happened. And I don't know. And since then, pretty much most of the legislative activity has centered around dealing with COVID-19. They do have a system, so they can meet now, and they are meeting. The Environment Committee is meeting today. The end of the session, I think, is May 18th, so there's not a lot of time. They may take up an issue like this. I don't know. They may have special sessions this year over the summer. I don't know. There's some talk of that. If the session ends and any bill that was up that was in the hopper this year, it's the end of the biennium. So everything would have to be, any bills, any legislation would have to be reintroduced next year, and we would work to do that, obviously. Todd says many thanks. Well done. Glad to see U of N getting involved. If you go to the Minnesota Lakes and Rivers website and sign up for the Citizen Action Network, you'll see a tab on the right-hand side of the site. You can sign up to get our emails. And when there's any legislation that pops up or any new information on this, or another event like this, we will send you an information on that. And it's also a one-click system. So if a bill comes up that you support, we'll send you an email on it, and you can contact your legislators where you live and vote just with a click, which is nice. And I'm seeing if there's any other questions here. Oh, have you, Jeff, have you ever worked with MACERC on other projects? I think you're on mute, Jeff.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah.
I have not worked myself with MACERC, but a colleague of mine named Jess Kozarek, who is, knee deep in this with me, is one of their fellows and works with MACERC all the time. And
Right.
a lot of her work is on invasive mussels.
Right. And Joe wanted to know, we will post the recording on our website. Probably by Monday it'll be up. The question is, can individual lake associations ban these types of boats on the lake? And the answer is no. Lake associations have no regulatory authority.
Jeff, this is Chuck. If
Yeah.
I can just comment on that. Actually, the state of Minnesota does have a process that individual lakes can, in essence, enact an ordinance that is specific to that lake only.
Right. That
And
would be the township board, though. That would be a township or a county. It would be a local government unit, not a lake association, which is what I was.
No, the lake association would have to go to their basically lowest level of government to ask them to petition the DNR to review language for an ordinance. If the DNR approves it, it goes back to that governing body. If they enact it, vote to enact it, then it does become an official ordinance for that lake only. And it is then, it goes on the DNR's website, and both the DNR COs and the County Water Patrol are responsible for enforcing that ordinance.
Right, right. And that's another piece of this whole thing is enforcement, like you said, Chuck, is really difficult. You have to catch them in the act. And let's say somebody's running over a spawning bed with their boat, and you give them a ticket for it and say, well, you were in 8 feet of water, and that's not permitted. And you go to court and you say, well, no, actually I was 10 feet over here where it's 20 feet deep.
Mm-hmm.
So, it gets difficult to enforce these things, which is why I think the education piece is so critically important. Well, it's 2:07 now, so we're over time. I again like to thank everybody for coming, and I'll send people some links after this. And be well and be safe. And thank you. And
Thank you, Jeff.
have a good weekend. Although it seems like, I don't know, either every day's Monday now or every day's Saturday, and it's hard to tell.
That's right.
But thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Chuck. I'm very grateful to you for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff.